Sarah Blackfeather stood in front of her bedroom mirror, carefully adjusting the turquoise necklace her grandmother had given her for her 17th birthday. The morning sunlight streamed through her window, making the stone's blue-green surface shimmer. It was the first day of her final semester at Riverside High School, and she wanted everything to be perfect. The necklace wasn't just jewelry, it was a reminder of who she was and where she came from. As a member of the Cherokee Nation, Sarah took great pride in her heritage, just as she took pride in being the top student in her class. Her walls were covered with academic certificates, honor roll mentions, and newspaper clippings of her achievements. Among them hung a dream catcher her mother had made, its feathers gently swaying in the morning breeze. "Sarah, breakfast is ready," her mother, Linda Blackfeather, called from downstairs. The smell of fresh coffee and toast wafted up to her room. In the kitchen, her father, Michael Blackfeather, sat at the table reading the morning newspaper. He worked as a tribal council member and always emphasized the importance of education. "Ready for your last semester, kiddo?" he asked, looking up with pride in his eyes. "More than ready," Sarah replied, sitting down to eat. Her perfect 4.0 GPA had already caught the attention of several prestigious universities. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Martinez, had told her she was on track to be valedictorian, the first Native American valedictorian in Riverside High's 60-year history. The Blackfeather family lived in a modest but well-kept house on the outskirts of town. Their home was filled with both traditional Cherokee artwork and modern amenities, reflecting their belief in honoring tradition while embracing the present. Sarah's study desk, visible from the kitchen window, was always neatly organized with color-coded notebooks and perfectly sharpened pencils. As Sarah ate her breakfast, she reviewed her schedule for the semester. Most of her classes would be with teachers she knew well, ones who had consistently recognized her hard work and intelligence. But there was one new name on her schedule, Mrs. Henderson, who would be teaching AP History. "I heard Mrs. Henderson just transferred from a private school in the city," Linda mentioned, pouring more coffee. "Mrs. Running Bear from the grocery store said her niece had her last year. Apparently, she's quite strict." Sarah wasn't worried. She had always excelled in history, especially when it came to Native American topics. Her father had taught her much about their people's past, and she regularly attended tribal council meetings where historical treaties and agreements were often discussed. This knowledge had always given her a unique perspective in class discussions. Before leaving for school, Sarah checked her backpack one last time. Each notebook was labeled, each textbook covered, and her laptop was fully charged. Her latest research paper on the impact of the Indian Removal Act was safely stored in both her computer and cloud storage. She had spent weeks on it over the winter break, ensuring every detail was perfect. The drive to school was quiet that morning. Sarah watched the landscape change from the rural outskirts to the small town of Riverside. The high school building came into view, a 3-story brick structure that had seen generations of students pass through its doors. The parking lot was already filling up with students returning from winter break. As Sarah walked through the main entrance, several teachers greeted her warmly. Mr. Patterson, her calculus teacher, waved from his classroom door. "Ready to keep that perfect math record going, Sarah?" he called out. She smiled and nodded confidently. In the hallway, her best friend Emma Chen rushed to hug her. "Sarah, I missed you," Emma exclaimed. "Did you finish that history paper over break? I spent forever on mine." "All done and triple-checked," Sarah replied, patting her backpack. "I focused on the Cherokee perspective of the Indian Removal Act. I think it's important to share our side of history." The two friends made their way to their first class, passing the school's trophy case. Sarah's name appeared multiple times on academic achievement plaques, debate team trophies, and science fair awards. A small group of freshmen pointed at her name, whispering admiringly. As the morning bell rang, Sarah took her seat in the front row of her first class. She felt ready for anything this semester might bring. Her dreams of becoming valedictorian and attending a top university seemed within reach. Little did she know that this semester would test not just her academic abilities, but her resilience, courage, and determination in ways she never expected. Sarah's first AP history class with Mrs. Henderson started like any other. The classroom was arranged in neat rows, and the walls were covered with historical maps and presidential portraits. Sarah took her usual seat in the front row, placing her carefully prepared research paper on her desk. Mrs. Henderson walked in exactly as the bell rang. She was a tall woman in her 50s, wearing a pressed gray suit and pearl earrings. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she wrote her name on the whiteboard. Without turning around, she began speaking in a clipped tone. "I've reviewed your winter break assignments," she announced, finally facing the class. Her eyes moved across the room, posing briefly on Sarah. Some were interesting. Others showed a concerning lack of objectivity. Sarah's heart skipped a beat when Mrs. Henderson began returning the papers. She watched as other students received their grades. Emma got an A. Jack Peterson received a B+, and Maria Santos smiled at her A. When Mrs. Henderson reached Sarah's desk, she placed the paper face down with a small frown. Sarah turned over her paper and stared in disbelief. There, written in bright red ink, was a C. Below it, Mrs. Henderson had written, "Too biased. Lacks academic distance from the subject matter. References need verification." The grade made no sense. Sarah had used the same format and citation style as always, drawing from respected historical sources and official documents. Her hands trembled slightly as she raised them to ask a question. "Mrs. Henderson, I don't understand this grade. Could you please explain what you mean by biased?" The teacher's lips tightened. "Miss Blackfeather, your paper focused too heavily on the Cherokee perspective. In academic writing, we need to maintain neutrality." Emma, sitting next to Sarah, looked confused. "But Mrs. Henderson, isn't Sarah's perspective valuable since she's Cherokee?" And she included quotes from multiple sources, including government documents. "That will be enough discussion about individual grades," Mrs. Henderson said sharply. "Now, let's move on to our unit on Western expansion." Throughout the class, Mrs. Henderson's lecture painted a rosy picture of manifest destiny. When Sarah politely raised her hand to mention the impact on Native communities, the teacher cut her off. "We'll discuss alternative viewpoints another time, Miss Blackfeather." That evening, Sarah spread her paper across the kitchen table. Her mother leaned over her shoulder, reading the comments with growing concern. "Look at this, Mom," Sarah said, pointing to her citations. "These are all from recognized historical sources. Some are even from government archives." Linda Blackfeather picked up the paper, her forehead creasing as she read. "And you used the same format as your other history papers? The ones that always earned A's?" "Exactly the same," Sarah confirmed. "I even had Mr. Patterson review it before break. He said it was excellent." Over the next few weeks, the pattern continued. Sarah's assignments consistently received lower grades than similar work from her classmates. In class discussions, Mrs. Henderson would often dismiss or cut short Sarah's contributions, especially on topics related to Native American history. During a lesson about the gold rush, Sarah mentioned the impact on California tribes. Mrs. Henderson's response was immediate and sharp. "Miss Blackfeather, we're focusing on the economic benefits to the nation. Please stay on topic." Other students began to notice. After class one day, Maria approached Sarah at her locker. "It's not fair how she treats you," she whispered. "Your answers in class are always well researched, and your essays are better than mine. I don't understand why she grades you so hard." Sarah tried to maintain her usual confidence, but her hands shook slightly when answering questions in AP history. She spent extra hours double-checking her work, trying to make it neutral enough for Mrs. Henderson. But no matter what she did, the grades remained low. One afternoon, Emma found Sarah in the library, surrounded by history books. "Are you okay? You've been here for hours." Sarah looked up, her eyes tired. "I'm trying to find more neutral sources for our next paper. Mom says I should document everything, the assignments, grades, and Mrs. Henderson's comments. Dad thinks we might need it later." As Sarah packed up her books that day, she caught her reflection in the library window. Her grandmother's turquoise necklace gleamed in the late afternoon light, reminding her of who she was and where she came from. She touched it gently, drawing strength from its familiar smoothness. The unfairness of the situation weighed heavily on her, but she refused to let one teacher's prejudice defeat her. What she didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning of a battle that would test her in ways she never expected. The Blackfeather family dining room had become a makeshift war room. Sarah's assignments, tests, and class notes were spread across the table in neat piles. Linda Blackfeather stood with her arms crossed, examining a wall calendar where they had started tracking every interaction with Mrs. Henderson. "Look at this pattern," Michael Blackfeather said, pointing to a series of assignments. He had started coming home early from tribal council meetings to help document everything. The same answers that got C's and D's for Sarah earned A's for other students. Sarah sat quietly, looking at her latest history test. She had scored a D+, even though she had studied for hours and knew the material perfectly. Next to her test lay Emma's, with nearly identical answers but marked with an A. Emma had secretly photocopied her test to help build their case. "It's not just the grades anymore," Sarah finally spoke up. "Yesterday, Mrs. Henderson picked teams for the history debate competition. She put me on the westward expansion topic, but assigned me to argue in favor of manifest destiny." Her voice cracked slightly. "When I asked to switch sides, she said I needed to learn to see both perspectives." Linda's face tightened with anger. "Both perspectives? As if we haven't been forced to see their perspective for centuries." She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm for Sarah's sake. "What did your other teachers say about this?" "Mr. Patterson is worried," Sarah replied, reaching for a letter of support he had written. "He says my math scores are still perfect, but he's noticed I seem anxious all the time now. Mrs. Martinez, the guidance counselor, is concerned too. She says my valedictorian status could be at risk if my history grade stays this low." The sound of the doorbell interrupted their discussion. It was Emma and Maria, carrying their own folders of evidence. Other students had started collecting proof too, secretly recording Mrs. Henderson's comments in class and keeping copies of their assignments for comparison. "We got 3 more students to share their graded papers," Emma announced, spreading out new documents on the table. "Look at this one." Jack wrote almost the exact same thing as Sarah about the Trail of Tears, but his paper got an A. Maria nodded, pulling out her phone. "And I recorded something in class today. Mrs. Henderson made another comment about certain students bringing too much personal bias into historical discussions." Sarah's father studied the growing pile of evidence. As a tribal council member, he had dealt with discrimination before, but seeing it affect his daughter made his heart heavy. "We need to be strategic about this," he said. "It's not just about Sarah anymore. This teacher is affecting other Native students too." They discovered that 2 Native American students from the previous semester had dropped AP History after a few weeks with Mrs. Henderson. One of them, John Running Horse, had been a straight-A student before her class. Later that evening, after Emma and Maria had gone home, Sarah sat at her desk trying to work on her latest history assignment. Her usual confidence in writing had been replaced by second-guessing every word. The topic was American heroes of the 1800s, and she struggled to write what Mrs. Henderson would want to hear while staying true to her own knowledge and beliefs. Her mother knocked softly and entered the room. "Sarah, honey, you've been staring at that blank paper for an hour." "I don't know what to write anymore, Mom," Sarah admitted, her voice small. "If I write the truth about these heroes and their actions against Native people, she'll fail me. If I write what she wants, I feel like I'm betraying who I am." Linda wrapped her arms around her daughter's shoulders. "Then write the truth. We have enough evidence now. The next parent-teacher conference is in 2 weeks, and your father and I will be there with everything we've collected." Sarah touched her grandmother's turquoise necklace, drawing strength from it as she always did. The stone felt warm against her skin, like a gentle reminder of all the strong women in her family who had faced discrimination before her. She opened her laptop and began to type, determined to write her honest analysis of history's so-called heroes. What the Blackfeathers didn't know was that their careful documentation was about to become crucial in a battle that would shake Riverside High School to its foundations. The final project for AP History was supposed to be Sarah's chance to turn everything around. The assignment seemed perfect. A comprehensive analysis of any major treaty between the United States government and Native American nations. This was a topic she knew better than anyone in class, having grown up attending tribal council meetings where these treaties were often discussed. Sarah spent 3 weeks researching, writing, and perfecting her paper on the Fort Laramie Treaty. She worked late into the night, surrounded by books borrowed from the tribal library and printouts of original documents. Her father had even helped her contact a history professor at the state university to verify her sources. "This is your best work yet," Emma said during their lunch break, after reading the final draft. She sat with Sarah in the school cafeteria, where their usual table had become a makeshift study group. There's no way she can fail this. You've included everything: government sources, historical documents, even contemporary newspaper accounts from both sides. Sarah managed a small smile, but her hands shook slightly as she organized her presentation materials. The dark circles under her eyes showed how little she'd slept, trying to make every detail perfect. Her turquoise necklace, now a constant source of comfort, caught the fluorescent cafeteria lights as she leaned forward. The day of presentations arrived. Sarah watched as her classmates delivered their projects. Most had chosen well-known treatises but offered only surface-level analysis. When it was her turn, she stood confidently at the front of the class, her research spread out on the podium. For 15 minutes, Sarah delivered a masterful presentation. She explained the complex negotiations, the promises made and broken, and the lasting impact on both Native American nations and the United States. Several students took extra notes, and even Mrs. Henderson's face remained unreadable instead of showing her usual disapproval. A week later, Mrs. Henderson handed back the graded projects. Sarah's heart stopped when she saw her paper. There, in bold red ink, was an F. "This is impossible," Sarah whispered, flipping through the pages. Mrs. Henderson's comments were brutal. Excessive focus on Native perspective. Fails to acknowledge the government's positive intentions. Sources appear biased. Fail to meet academic standards. The room spun slightly as Sarah raised her hand, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mrs. Henderson, I don't understand. I used primary sources from both government and tribal archives. I included perspectives from both sides. Could you please explain the failing grade?" Mrs. Henderson's response was cold. "Miss Blackfeather, your personal connection to this topic has clearly prevented you from maintaining academic objectivity. Perhaps next time you should choose a subject where you can be more neutral." Emma stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. "That's not fair. Sarah's paper was the best in class. You're failing her because she's Cherokee." "Sit down, Miss Chen," Mrs. Henderson snapped. "This is not up for discussion. Miss Blackfeather's grade stands." The rest of the class passed in a blur. When the bell rang, Sarah remained seated, staring at the F that would destroy her perfect GPA and her chances of being valedictorian. Years of hard work, of proving herself, of breaking barriers, all potentially ruined by one teacher's prejudice. Later that afternoon, in Mrs. Martinez's office, the guidance counselor's face was grave as she looked at Sarah's updated transcript. "With this F in AP History, your overall GPA will drop to 3.7. I'm sorry, Sarah, but this means you're no longer in the running for valedictorian." Sarah sat very still, her grandmother's necklace clutched in her hand. "All my college applications emphasized my perfect academic record. The scholarships I applied for, they all require." Her voice trailed off as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. For the first time since Mrs. Henderson's class began, Sarah allowed herself to cry. That evening, the Blackfeather house was unusually quiet. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her failed project spread out before her, while her parents talked in hushed, angry voices in the living room. Through the doorway, she could hear fragments of their conversation. Lawyer, discrimination, school board. Sarah touched her necklace one last time, feeling the smooth stone beneath her fingers. In that moment, something inside her shifted. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every Native student who might face Mrs. Henderson or teachers like her in the future. She stood up, walked to the living room, and faced her parents. "I want to fight this," she said firmly. "Not just for me, but for everyone." What happened next would shake not just Riverside High School, but the entire educational system in their district. The Tribal Council building buzzed with activity on a sunny Saturday morning. Michael Blackfeather had called an emergency meeting, and the room was packed with concerned community members. Sarah sat between her parents, clutching a thick folder containing months of evidence against Mrs. Henderson. Chief Robert Whitecloud, a tall man with silver hair and kind eyes, studied the documents spread across the conference table. "This is more than just a few bad grades," he said, his voice deep and thoughtful. "This is systematic discrimination." David Running Bear, the tribal council's legal advisor, nodded in agreement. "We've seen cases like this before, but rarely with such detailed documentation." He picked up Sarah's failed treaty project. This work is college-level research. The failing grade is completely unjustifiable. Sarah watched as more people arrived, teachers from other schools, former students who had encountered Mrs. Henderson, and even local news reporters who had gotten wind of the story. Emma and Maria sat nearby, ready to share their witness accounts. Mr. Patterson, Sarah's calculus teacher, stood up to speak. I taught at Riverside High for 20 years. Sarah is one of the finest students I've ever had. This sudden drop in her grades in one specific class, with one specific teacher, isn't just suspicious, it's a clear pattern of bias. The school board meeting was scheduled for Monday afternoon. Over the weekend, support for Sarah grew stronger. Other Native American students began sharing their own stories of discrimination. John Running Horse, who had dropped AP History earlier in the year, came forward with his experience. Mrs. Henderson told me I was too emotionally attached to historical events. John explained to the tribal council. She said I needed to be more objective about the colonization of America. Linda Blackfeather had been busy too, reaching out to civil rights organizations and educational advocacy groups. By Monday morning, their case had caught the attention of the Native American Rights Fund, who sent a representative to attend the school board meeting. The school board meeting room was packed. Sarah sat in the front row, wearing her grandmother's turquoise necklace and a ribbon skirt her mother had made for important occasions. Behind her sat rows of supporters, students, teachers, tribal members, and community leaders. Principal Stevens opened the meeting, looking uncomfortable as he faced the crowd. We're here to address serious allegations regarding grading practices and potential discrimination in Mrs. Henderson's AP History class. Michael Blackfeather presented their case first. He walked the board through the evidence, the pattern of decreasing grades, the contradictory feedback, the identical answers receiving different scores based on the student's background. His voice remained calm but firm as he showed example after example. Emma and Maria testified next, sharing their observations and providing their own assignments for comparison. Mr. Patterson presented his analysis of Sarah's academic record, showing her consistent excellence in all other subjects. Then Sarah stood up to speak. The room fell silent as she walked to the podium, her ribbon skirt swaying gently. She had practiced her speech all weekend, but now she spoke from her heart. I'm not here just for myself, she began, her voice clear and strong. I'm here for every student who has been told their perspective doesn't matter because of who they are. I'm here for every Native American student who has been asked to be neutral about their own history. She held up her failed treaty project. This paper represents months of research, drawing from both government and tribal sources. It includes perspectives from all sides. But Mrs. Henderson didn't fail it because of poor research or bad writing. She failed it because I refused to ignore my people's truth. As Sarah spoke, Mrs. Henderson sat rigidly in her chair, her face pale. When given the chance to respond, her explanations about maintaining academic standards and preventing personal bias sounded hollow in the face of such overwhelming evidence. The Tribal Council's legal team presented additional cases they had uncovered. Other Native American students whose grades had suffered under Mrs. Henderson at her previous schools. The pattern stretched back years. By the end of the meeting, it was clear to everyone in the room that this was about more than just one student's grades. This was about changing a system that had allowed such discrimination to go unchecked for too long. As the school board went into closed session to deliberate, Sarah stood surrounded by her supporters, feeling stronger than she had in months. Whatever the board decided, she knew this was just the beginning of a larger fight for change. The next 2 weeks at Riverside High School felt like being under a microscope. Dr. Emily Martinez, an independent educational investigator with 30 years of experience in civil rights cases, had arrived to conduct a thorough review of the situation. Her temporary office, set up in an unused classroom, quickly filled with stacks of student records and testimonies. Sarah watched from her locker as Dr. Martinez interviewed students one by one. The investigator's kind face and gentle manner made it easier for people to share their experiences. Even students who had graduated years ago came forward to tell their stories about Mrs. Henderson. We found similar patterns at her previous schools, Dr. Martinez explained to the Blackfeather family during their meeting. She spread out a timeline on her desk, showing Mrs. Henderson's employment history. At each school, Native American students' grades dropped significantly in her classes, while other students maintained their usual performance levels. The investigation uncovered more than just grade discrimination. Mrs. Henderson's class materials and lecture notes revealed a consistent bias in how she presented historical events. Dr. Martinez's team found that topics relating to Native American history were either minimized or presented only from a European settler perspective. "Look at this," Dr. Martinez said, showing Sarah and her parents a stack of graded papers. "When non-native students wrote about the Trail of Tears using your exact same sources, they received A's and B's. But when you and other native students wrote about it, you were marked down for being too emotional or lacking objectivity." The investigation also revealed something unexpected. In Mrs. Henderson's desk, they found a personal journal where she had written her thoughts about teaching history. The entries showed a deep-seated prejudice against allowing what she called revisionist perspectives into historical education. One morning, Sarah arrived at school to find Dr. Martinez interviewing Mr. Patterson in the hallway. Sarah's work has always been exceptional, she overheard him saying. She has a natural gift for analysis and critical thinking. The idea that she suddenly became a poor student in one specific class is, frankly, absurd. Other teachers came forward with similar statements. Mrs. Rodriguez, the English teacher, provided copies of Sarah's essays about historical literature, all graded A, with notes praising her sophisticated understanding of historical context. The evidence kept mounting. During lunch breaks, Sarah often saw Dr. Martinez talking with Emma and Maria, who shared their careful documentation of class events. They had kept a detailed record of every time Mrs. Henderson had dismissed or belittled Native perspectives in class discussions. Yesterday, she told Lisa Strongbow that her family's oral histories weren't reliable sources, Maria reported, showing Dr. Martinez her notes. But when Jack Peterson talked about his great-grandfather's letters from the gold rush, she called it valuable primary source material. The investigation expanded beyond just Mrs. Henderson's class. Dr. Martinez began looking at the school's overall treatment of Native American students and their history. She found that while Riverside High had a significant Native American student population, their perspectives and experiences were largely absent from the curriculum. One afternoon, Sarah was called back to Dr. Martinez's office. The investigator sat behind her desk, surrounded by weeks of collected evidence. "Sarah," she said gently, "I want you to know that what you've done here is incredibly important. Your courage in speaking up has helped uncover a pattern that goes beyond one teacher or one school." Dr. Martinez showed Sarah a preliminary report she was preparing for the school board. The document was thick, filled with charts, testimonies, and detailed analysis. "This isn't just about grades anymore," she explained. "This is about systemic bias in how history is taught, and whose perspectives are considered valid in academic settings." Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she read through the report's conclusions. Every low grade, every dismissive comment, every unfair evaluation was documented and analyzed, showing a clear pattern of discrimination that couldn't be explained away. As she left Dr. Martinez's office that day, Sarah passed Mrs. Henderson in the hallway. The teacher who had once seemed so intimidating now looked small and defensive, aware that her years of discriminatory practices were finally being exposed. The investigation was coming to an end, but its findings would have implications far beyond what anyone at Riverside High had expected. The next day, Dr. Martinez would present her final report to the school board, and nothing would ever be the same. The school board meeting room was even more crowded than before. Sarah sat between her parents, her heart pounding as Dr. Martinez prepared to present her findings. The room buzzed with tension. Students, teachers, tribal members, and local media all waited to hear the results of the investigation. Board Chairman Richard Thompson called the meeting to order. "Dr. Martinez, please present your report on the investigation into alleged discriminatory practices at Riverside High School." Dr. Martinez stood at the podium, her detailed report projected on the screen behind her. "After a thorough investigation spanning 3 weeks, we have uncovered substantial evidence of systematic discrimination against Native American students in Mrs. Henderson's AP history class." The room fell silent as she began showing slides of evidence. Graphs displayed the stark contrast between Native and non-Native students' grades. Screenshots of Mrs. Henderson's personal notes revealed clear bias. Testimony after testimony painted a picture of long-term discrimination. Most notably, Dr. Martinez continued, "We found that Sarah Blackfeather's failing grade on her treaty project was completely unjustified. Multiple history professors from state universities reviewed her work and rated it as college-level research." Mrs. Henderson, sitting in the back row, grew paler with each revelation. When given a chance to respond, her explanations about maintaining academic standards crumbled under the weight of evidence. Principal Stevens spoke next, his voice heavy with responsibility. "Based on these findings, we recommend immediate action. First, all of Mrs. Henderson's grades for Native American students will be reviewed and adjusted by an independent committee." Sarah felt her mother squeeze her hand as Principal Stevens continued. "Furthermore, we propose implementing mandatory cultural competency training for all staff members, with special emphasis on teaching historical perspectives." The Tribal Council's legal team presented their recommendations next. Chief Whitecloud stood tall as he addressed the board. "This isn't just about correcting grades. This is about acknowledging and respecting our people's history and perspectives in education." After 2 hours of presentations and deliberations, Chairman Thompson called for the board's decision. The room held its breath as he spoke. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, the board has reached several decisions," he announced. "First, Mrs. Henderson's employment at Riverside High School is terminated, effective immediately." A murmur ran through the crowd. Sarah sat straighter in her chair as Chairman Thompson continued. "Second, all grades assigned by Mrs. Henderson will be reviewed and adjusted based on objective criteria. This includes retroactive changes to GPAs and class rankings where necessary." Linda Blackfeather wiped tears from her eyes as the chairman went on. "Third, we are establishing a Diversity in Education Committee, which will include representatives from the Tribal Council to review and enhance our curriculum. This committee will ensure that Native American history and perspectives are properly represented in our teaching materials." The changes didn't stop there. The board announced a comprehensive plan to transform how history was taught at Riverside High. New resources would be added to the library. Guest speakers from various cultural backgrounds would be invited to share their perspectives. Teachers would receive ongoing training in cultural sensitivity and inclusive education. After the meeting, Sarah's classmates surrounded her with hugs and congratulations. Emma couldn't stop smiling. "You did it, Sarah. You changed everything." Mr. Patterson approached with news that made Sarah's heart soar. "With your AP history grade corrected, you're back at the top of the class. Congratulations, Sarah. You're still on track to be valedictorian." The next day at school felt different. There was a substitute teacher in AP history, and the atmosphere was lighter, more open. Students from all backgrounds felt free to share their perspectives on historical events. Sarah watched as workers took down some of the old historical maps in the classroom, preparing to replace them with new ones that would show a more complete picture of American history. On the bulletin board, there was a new sign announcing the first meeting of the Diversity in Education Committee. During lunch, Principal Stevens made an announcement over the intercom. The school would be hosting a special assembly where local tribal elders would share their stories and perspectives on American history. It was the first of many changes to come. That afternoon, as Sarah walked to her car, she passed Mrs. Henderson's now empty parking spot. Her hand went to her grandmother's turquoise necklace, and she smiled. The fight hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Not just for her, but for every student who would walk through Riverside High's doors in the future. What started as one student's stand against injustice had sparked a transformation that would impact generations to come. 3 months later, on a warm spring evening, Sarah stood at the podium in her graduation gown, the valedictorian's gold cord gleaming around her shoulders. The setting sun cast a golden light across the football field where the ceremony was being held, and hundreds of faces looked up at her expectantly. Her grandmother's turquoise necklace caught the light as she began her speech. "When I started my senior year at Riverside High, I thought success meant keeping quiet and fitting in. I was wrong. Sometimes success means standing up and speaking out." The audience was larger than usual for a graduation ceremony. Representatives from other school districts had come to hear her speak. Local news cameras rolled in the back. Sarah's story had spread beyond their small town, inspiring changes in schools across the state. "Because of what happened this year," she continued, our school has transformed. Today, our history classes tell the whole story, not just one side. Our library has new books that share different perspectives. Our teachers are learning alongside us, growing and changing too. In the front row, Sarah could see Emma and Maria, both crying happy tears. Behind them sat Mr. Patterson, who had stood by her from the beginning. Members of the tribal council were present too, including Chief Whitecloud, who had helped implement the new educational programs. But the biggest change isn't in our textbooks or our teaching methods, Sarah said, her voice strong and clear. It's in how we view ourselves and each other. Every student now knows that their voice matters, their perspective is valuable, and their truth deserves to be heard. The changes at Riverside High had indeed been remarkable. The new Diversity in Education Committee, which included students and tribal representatives, had already made significant improvements. History classes now featured regular guest speakers from various cultural backgrounds. The school library had a new section dedicated to Native American literature and historical accounts. Last week, Sarah shared with the audience, I watched our freshman class present their history projects. They included perspectives from all sides of historical events. They cited oral histories alongside government documents. They weren't afraid to ask hard questions or challenge traditional narratives. She paused, looking at her parents in the crowd. Her mother was wiping away tears, while her father sat tall and proud. None of this would have happened without the support of my family, my teachers, my friends, and our entire community. When one person stands up for what's right, others will stand with them. The impact of Sarah's case had reached far beyond Riverside High. Other schools in the district had adopted similar changes to their curriculum. The State Education Board was reviewing its guidelines for teaching history, considering new standards that would ensure multiple perspectives were included. As I prepare to leave for college, Sarah continued, touching her necklace, I know that my journey doesn't end here. This fall, I'll be attending the University of Arizona, majoring in education with a minor in Native American Studies. My goal is to become a teacher myself, to help create classrooms where every student's heritage is respected and every voice is heard. The audience broke into applause at this announcement. Sarah had received a full scholarship, and the university had asked her to help develop programs for inclusive education. To my fellow graduates, I leave you with this message. Never let anyone tell you that your perspective doesn't matter. Never let anyone make you feel ashamed of who you are or where you come from. Your identity is not a bias, it's a strength. As Sarah concluded her speech, she saw something remarkable. Students, parents, teachers, and community members, people from all backgrounds, rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Among them were several Native American students who had previously dropped out of AP classes, now inspired to return and share their perspectives. Later that evening, at the graduation party held at the Tribal Community Center, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers. A young freshman girl approached her shyly. Your story inspired me to sign up for AP History next year, she said. I'm not afraid anymore. Sarah smiled, remembering how she had felt at the beginning of the year. Just remember, she told the girl, your voice matters. Your truth matters. As she looked around at the celebration, Sarah realized that what had started as her personal fight for justice had become something much bigger. It had become a movement for change, a call for understanding, and a promise for future generations that their stories would be heard and respected. The turquoise necklace around her neck seemed to glow in the evening light, a symbol of the strength she had found in her heritage and the bridges she had helped build between communities. This wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning.